You're working just the way you always have, maybe even better. You're more experienced, handling tasks with ease. Then it starts. Your opinion's no longer relevant. You're always overqualified. Suddenly, you're unemployable. This isn't part of aging, it's ageism. Everyone deserves to age without limits. Let's make it a reality. Ageism. Notice it, challenge it, change it. Search Age Without Limits.
This week, I'm talking with Nicola Marshall, a grief certified educator. Basically, she helps people to navigate their way through grief. As we get older, we often begin to think of our own mortality and how it will impact family and friends. It's something that's going to happen to all of us. Yet, as a society, we're not very good at knowing what to do and what to say when somebody dies. Nicola told me how she had a front row seat to grief when her son Lucas died 5 years ago, and how she's now set up a meet and grief cafe, a safe space for those coping with grief. But before we listen to this latest podcast, can I ask you to please subscribe, follow, rate and share it. Welcome to Retirement Rebel Life After 60. I'm your host, Siobhan Daniels. Join me on a journey to meet inspiring rebels who've redefined retirement. Together, we'll explore new passions, triumphs over challenges, and discover the vibrant possibilities of life after 60. This is about living boldly, not just aging. So, are you ready to rebel? Last week, I had the pleasure of talking with Dr. Carol Easton, OBE. She's the Chief Executive of the Centre for Aging Better. And we talked all about their 3-year campaign that's trying to combat ageism in society. And we talked about how well it's been received. And we also talked about how they're tackling the problem of ageism in the workplace. If you missed it, it's available on all podcast platforms and on my website, retirementrebel.co.uk. Good morning, Nicola. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning, Siobhan. How are you today?
I'm very well. Now, what exactly is a grief certified educator? What do they do?
So, a grief certified educator is somebody who is committed to providing the highest level of grief support through education and experience, offering insights into often the unacknowledged rocky terrain of grief. And the grief educator was completed with David Kessler, who's a world-renowned grief educator. And it basically just brings a unique methodology of tools and decades of his experience to help people navigate the challenges of grief.
I mean, we're pretty crap at it, aren't we, as a nation, dealing with grief?
We absolutely are. And it's a subject, really, we don't like to talk about. And I think it's really important that we do talk about it because, you know, grief happens throughout our life on different scales.
And one of the reasons I wanted to have you on the podcast and to talk about grief was because it's something, as you're getting older, you start thinking about how long have you got left, about when you die, about your loved ones left behind. And I think it's so important that we actually start telling our loved ones what it is we want when we die, so that it helps them go through the grieving process.
Yeah, totally. I mean, without life, we don't have death, and without death, we don't have life. So they do come hand in hand. And I think it's really important to talk to your loved ones while they are here, so you know what they would like when they leave us, you know, whether that be their favorite hymn, their favorite song, prayer, whatever it is, or however they, you know, wish to be remembered.
When was the first time that you in your life experienced any form of grief? Can you remember?
I absolutely can. The first form of grief that I had was when my grandfather died. I must have been about 7 or 8. And I can remember that back then, the coffin would be brought back to the house. There was neighbours in the road that would dress the living room ready for the coffin. And then people would come by and pay their respects. And they'd have a cup of tea and a sandwich handed over the coffin, you know. And I can remember, and I wasn't allowed in, but my cousin snuck me in to see my granddad. And I can remember I touched his hair and I thought, oh, it was so silky.
Oh, my goodness.
I know. And then my grandma died a couple of years after that. And something I always remember, because the house would be cleaned and that room would be dressed by these particular, and I remember it was Mary and Betty in my nan's road.
It's amazing the things you remember, isn't it?
I know. And they would come and dress the room all in white and put lilies and things. And then the coffin would come home. My nan was in her favourite outfit and my cousin did her hair. It's so funny.
So you've got some really good memories, haven't you, actually? Did you feel sad at the time? Did you feel fearful? Did you understand what was going on?
I didn't really understand what was going on because we just wasn't talked about. I just knew that my grandparents had died and the coffin would come back and there would be a wake and, a funeral and a wake that I wasn't allowed to go to, was not allowed to go to because children were not allowed to be at funerals, which again, for me personally, I don't agree with. So that was my earliest memory of grief, I guess. And I felt sad because it was my nan and granddad who had died, but I didn't really understand it.
Because it wasn't talked about.
Wasn't talked about. And that was it. And then pretty much you never talked about that person again, very rarely, unless I said, I really miss my nan. But we wouldn't regale in lots of tales about them, like we do now.
Yeah, you actually found a different way of dealing with grief by meeting with a tribe of people, didn't you? What was that?
Yeah, well, I met with the Mauian healers and I still had a lot of unresolved grief and a lot of grief that I was dealing with. And when you say unresolved, that was childhood and ancestral grief. And so I had the amazing pleasure, and I couldn't believe it happened. And they were over in the UK and I met them and had some treatment with them. And it was with Atarangi Mure and it was amazing. And she released a lot of trapped and unresolved trauma from my body because, the body does keep score and we hold on to that trauma inside our body. And if we don't allow it to flow through, it comes out in different things like arthritis or, pain or something like this.
Now, you had a brother who sadly passed away as well, didn't you?
Yeah, well, sort of like the major traumas that I've had have been my best friend died at 31 and she died of cancer and she was diagnosed and then she was dead pretty much within 6 months. And that was so painful because we were going to rule the world together, And then when my brother was 29, Paul, sadly, he took his own life. And I just had my son in 2006. And my brother, Paul, took his own life in the December 2006. It was really, really traumatic because not only was I dealing with the joy and the birth of having my son, I then had to deal with the death of my brother. So if I'm really honest, I'm not sure I grieved fully for him at that time.
And how did people cope with when he died and how did they interact with you? Were they supportive or was it a difficult time for you?
It was a really difficult time for me because, again, I'm trying to keep buoyant. I'm a new mum and I'm understanding all the changes that are going around in my body. I'm trying to support my mum. And my mum's the sort of person who really kind of closes down and doesn't want to talk about things. And within my family, we would talk about it. But I don't think that we talked openly. Now, yes, but at the time, not really.
That must have been hard.
It was a really tough time because, as I say, my mum is the sort of person who will not talk about things and she bottles all her emotions up, which again, is something that I don't agree with.
But there may be some people finding it difficult even now that we are talking about grief. They'll think it's a very deep, sad subject to be talking about. It's not something that you do talk about, but I really do feel I want to try and help normalise that we can talk a bit more. So it takes away a bit of the fear and helps us support one another when we see friends and family going through grief. And it helps us ourselves prepare for when we die, to help prepare our relatives. Now, fast forwarding quite a few years, you really did get a front seat to grief yourself, didn't you? You had a very traumatic experience. And I know it's not easy for you to tell us. And I know that you want to do it because you want to help other people. Do you want to tell me what happened?
Yes, I do. And it is a tough time at the moment as well because I don't know, as I said earlier, your body keeps score. So my body remembers that something happened this time that was really traumatic to me 5 years ago. In 2006, August 2006, I was on holiday with my son, Lucas, who was 12, and his friend. It was the last day of our holiday. We were in Spain at his grandparents' apartment. We'd just been for a swim. We came up and I was making sandwiches. And then 2 hours, we would have been in a taxi going to the airport. I came out of the kitchen to speak to Lucas, and his friend said, he's gone over the balcony. And I didn't really register. I didn't understand. I remember saying, are you joking me? And I ran through the apartment to the balcony and looked over, and there was my son.
I know no words can express how you must have been in that moment. And I really do appreciate that you want to come on and talk about it.
I do, because I think it's really important that we do talk about it and we normalise our grief and our sadness. And it's okay, to show your vulnerability because, as I say, it is one of our superpowers. So my son, he died in front of me. And for the first time in his life, I couldn't help him. And that was really, really tough because I was a single parent and I was mum and dad. And I've always been there for Lucas. So that was a really, really tough moment. And it was, it all seemed, everything was in slow motion. And then I lay with my son for over an hour before they took him away in a body bag.
You then were starting your grieving process, the most horrendous time of your life. What kind of impact did it have on your family and friends? And did they respond the way you needed them to respond? Or was it then that you realised that we're just crap at dealing with grieving?
Well, nobody knows what to say or how to deal with things. And people are so scared around you, but the worst thing that could happen happened to me. And, Lucas was my life. And so now I had to reconstruct my life without my son. And that first year was totally horrific. And I don't remember much about it because I was in deep shock, deep trauma. My head was still trying to come to terms with the fact that my son was no longer on this earth. That and I struggled because I was like, am I still a mum? Am I not? And so many questions come into your head, and the people you expect to step up, they don't. And the people you least expect, they do step up.
When you say step up, what do you mean?
Well, they step up and support you and are there for you. What you do realise, and I think, some of your viewers out there can relate to this, is once the funeral is done, everyone else goes back to their lives, to their normal lives, and your life is no longer normal. And what do you go back to, and how do you go back to that? So finding the support at that time is really, really important.
Did you find that people were impatient, the fact that you were grieving, and they felt that you had a finite length of time to be grieving, and then it's kind of get on with your life. This has happened. You need to deal with it.
I found people, one thing I did say at Lucas's funeral, I did stand up and talk, and I said, if you see me in the street, please come over, give me a hug, tell me a funny story about Lucas, or tell me something that I wouldn't know unless you told me about Lucas, because I want to talk about him and I enjoy talking about him. So I tried to help people by saying that, because what I didn't want was for people to cross over the road and talking to different people who've lost their loved ones. That's what happens.
Really?
And I didn't want that. I wanted people to feel comfortable enough to come up to me and just hug me. Sometimes when you do see people who are grieving, you don't need to say anything. A hug, a handhold, a smile, that's all they need. You don't need to, when people say to me, I don't know how you're coping, I say, just ask. Ask me and I'll tell you how I'm coping. And some days when people say, how are you? I'll say, not great today. Not great. I'm very honest with my feelings.
I noticed you said at the beginning of this interview, you felt strongly that children should be allowed to go to funerals and children should be allowed to grieve.
Mm.
There are a lot of people who would feel, oh, no, certainly not. You need to keep children away from grief and from death. Why do you feel that they should be going to funerals? And have you seen examples of where they do?
Well, there was a lot of children at Lucas's funeral. And and one thing I said, I didn't want people wearing black. I wanted people to wear some, lovely clothes because Lucas loved bright, flowery shirts and things like this. And there was a lot of children there. Children grieve. Children have feelings. And I think it's really important that we talk to them about their feelings, their grief. We explain to them about the loss and what's happened to the person, because it's part of life. It's part of life. And you don't want to give them false hope that they're going to come back, or, they've gone somewhere and they'll be back soon, or you'll see them soon. Explain to them about it.
It is hard. I know personally from me, I messed up with my daughter when her grandma died on her father's side. She was only very young. She was about 5 and she was out playing and I'd got the news through. And so I'd had a little bit of a cry and she came in and she could see I'd been crying. And we knew that her grandma had been poorly, but we didn't expect her to die. And I said, oh, it's grandma, it's grandma. I said, she's died. And the pain that I saw on my daughter's face, I just suddenly panicked and I backtracked and I went, no, she's not dead. She's poorly. And then, of course, later on that day, I then had to lie on the bed with her and cuddle her and explain. So her poor grandma went from being alive to being dead to being alive to being dead again. And I
what a miracle.
But you know what? I would have thought I would have been better than that. But the whole thought of dealing with grief and pain and loss and having to explain to a little child, I really appreciate that there are people like you out there that are trying to get the conversation going and trying to help people navigate through what can be a very scary process.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Lucas's little cousin, he is 7, and he loves talking to me about Lucas. And he asks me, "Is Lucas in that crystal on your chain?" I say, "Essence of Lucas is there," And then, "Is he in the clouds?" I say, "Some of Lucas is in the clouds," And so I say to him, you can talk to Lucas, and when you go to bed, you might have a dream about him, and then that's him talking back to you.
Oh, that's lovely.
Yeah, we talk lots about Lucas to my little cousin. I love that.
But there is still very much in Britain that stiff upper lip, isn't there? Different cultures grieve in different ways. I mean, some cultures that they include the whole family, don't they? It's almost like a celebration as opposed to grieving.
Yeah, and you know what? Really, particularly if somebody has a really long life, you should be celebrating their life, because if they've had a long life and it has been an amazing life, celebrate them and tell the stories, because I still love hearing old stories about my grandma. And I love talking about Lucas' funny times when he was little and things like this. So, yeah, I mean, everybody grieves differently and no one grief is the same. It's as individual, isn't it, as our thumbprint. So I think just be mindful around people who are grieving, because people do ask you crazy things. And you're right, something you said earlier, people expect you to get over your grief. And I will grieve for Lucas for the rest of my life, because grief is love and I love my son.
That's interesting you say grief is love. What do you mean by that?
Well, we grieve because we miss them and because we love them and we care about them. And there is a space missing where that person was. I will never stop loving Lucas.
So you mean you've had to love somebody first, really, to create that space to then create grief? So love is that what you're saying?
I do, but also we grieve for people we don't know. For instance, there was people who was grieving for the Queen. They'd never met her, but there was an empty space left where the Queen was. We grieve for actors or actresses, pop stars. We may never have met them, but they were important to us in our life for whatever reason. So I think it's the empty space that person has left.
I'm just going to interrupt for a moment to shamelessly plug my book, Retirement Rebel. It's published by Vertebrate Publishers, and it's my honest account of feeling broken in my 50s and finding my happy place in my mid-60s. I got rid of my home and possessions and hit the road in my motorhome for a roller coaster ride along life's adventures. I want it to help younger women not to fear aging and older women to grab life and run with it. You can purchase a copy in most bookstores and on Amazon. Right, now back to the conversation. Now, you've used your own personal experiences to help others. What made you want to do that? And was it because you were struggling with your own grief, or had you come to a point where you thought, I can help people?
Yeah, I had a bad experience really with a grief counsellor. And so I decided to study as soon as I felt able to. After 2 years after Lucas died, I've started a psychotherapeutic counselling course, and since then doing hypnotherapy, EMDR, which is rapid eye movements for trauma, to unlock trauma, and grief counselling, grief educator. And I first came across David Kessler. I'd read books of his in the past, but I was on a webinar and he was there, and I just really enjoyed listening to him, how he dealt with grief.
And how does he deal with grief?
He deals with it by talking about it and allowing and witnessing it. And I think that's really important. You have to witness people's grief. And all that means is listening to them, giving them the time and the space to just talk and just be there and let them talk and talk and talk.
You've created a cafe, haven't you?
Yes, I have. I've created the Meet and Grief Café. And the reason I did that was, again, I just wanted a space to talk about my grief, to see where I was, and to allow people to meet me where I was, and so I could meet them where they were within their grief process. And I just created a safe space here in Knutsford. We meet once a month, and it's just a cup of tea, cake, sometimes pizza. And it just allows people to talk and air their grievances, their anger, their sadness, their loneliness, however they're feeling.
Because there are so many different phases you go through, aren't there?
Yeah. There are the stages of grief you go through, but these stages are just linear, You may feel depressed, denial and anger, but they come at different times. I felt so guilty when Lucas died. If only I'd done this differently, if only. And that was horrific for the first year. And I think once I started to accept the loss and the grief, and once I allowed the grief in, and that's when the real healing started.
What kind of people come to the cafe, and what do they talk about? Is it a sad place is what I'm trying to get at? Do they come and sort of all I just imagine not wallowing in grief, but is it something that sheds a light on grief?
It definitely sheds a light on grief. It is sad, but we talk. There's people who will vent their anger. There's lots of laughter and there's support. But yeah, we talk about all the different experiences that we have. And there are people there who've lost children. There are people who've lost their partners, their parents, friends. There's lots of different people there experience grief in their way. And I think it's good for them because what they say, it's not morbid. They can just come and talk and vent if that's what they need.
What would you say to somebody, if they've got an elderly relative and they will be dealing with their funeral and the arrangements for their death? How would you tell them the best way to broach the subject of talking about death? Because some people just really do not want to face what is going to happen to us all, and they don't want to talk about it. So it is a difficult subject, really. So we don't talk about it, and then when the funeral happens, nobody seems to know what the heck's going on.
It is difficult. And I know that because I've been trying to talk to my mother about her. So she really doesn't want to talk about it. But as I said, try and make it relaxed, cup of tea, piece of cake, and say, what hymns do you like? What's your favorite prayer? And just things like that. Because don't forget, when you're dead, you won't be able to tell us. So if you tell us now, make it light-hearted. When I'm talking to my mum, and trust me, it is not an easy subject, I try and be very light-hearted about it. I've still not got it out of her, but I'm not giving up.
But there is no standard approach to grieving, is there?
No, we all grieve differently. And, and also it depends on the type of death. My grief particularly was complicated because it was something that I wasn't expecting. It was a total shock. It wasn't as though Lucas had an illness and then I was, was starting to prepare or anything like that. It was a total shock. So it was completely complicated, my grief. So everyone's grief is different and you cannot prepare because you don't know how you're going to feel once that person is no longer here. What I do now is I love talking about Lucas and I celebrate his life. I finally got to a place where I celebrate his life. Even yesterday morning, I was walking and I feel so much sadness and so much grief. And I just said an affirmation and I just said, I'm going to allow the grief to flow through me. I'm going to allow the sadness to flow through me. This is grief. This is love. And that's what I kept saying as I was walking. Life is precious. And I think we only get one life. And it's really important that we live it to the fullest. And try not to let fear hold us back. And, I did that for many, many years. And since Lucas has died, I've achieved so much in my life, things that I would never be doing, which is sad, but I'm doing them now.
One thing I found refreshing there was you said you're going to allow yourself to feel the fear, to feel the sadness, to let the emotions go through you. Again, as a nation, as a culture, I don't think that we do that, do we? We bottle an awful lot in, but it's going to come out at some stage. In this journey that I've been doing, living in my motorhome, one of the things that I did very, very early on was go to the edge of a loch in Scotland. And I stood there and I screamed and I shouted and I grieved my father who died when I was 16, my brother and sister who both died at 23. And all sorts of emotions, but I was getting rid of all the negative, the things that were making me feel angry. But that sense of grieving and shouting out and literally screaming out, I understand why some cultures do that. When they're standing at gravesides, you hear this almost gut-wrenching scream and crying. And it is important because once I let it out, I can then look at them and my time and my life with them differently.
Yeah, I totally agree. I know the first time I did that huge scream and let it out, I was on a beach and I just screamed and screamed and screamed and just let all of that out. And I remember I fell to my knees and I just cried and cried and cried. And that's all I could do. But again, it took me, I would say, over a year before I started to allow the grief in. I fought it every second. I didn't want it to come in and I didn't want to feel this way, but I was angry and I was sad and I got very low. And then once I understood that the grief is love and I allowed it in, then I started to gently grow around my grief and the grief turned to more love and pain and keeps doing that.
Do you think we should even start talking about death and grief and coping with it when we're in school, when we're a lot younger, so that it's something a bit like learning strategies of how to cope with life and things that you'll come up against?
I absolutely think that's an amazing idea. I think that's a brilliant idea. I think it will show us just how fragile life is. And I know Lucas's year, because Lucas died in his first year of high school. I actually buried him on his 13th birthday. I know that year group of Lucas's, they were so close. I'd go into the school each year because they have a trophy and I'd present the trophy in Lucas's name. And the headmaster and all the teachers said that year group was such a close year group and a beautiful year group because they understood the loss or the pain of loss, and how it really felt. And I think they talked about it to themselves, but I agree with you. We need to talk about it more so in schools so they understand it.
I know part of doing this podcast is trying to break down the fears about getting old and what being old is and aging positively. And I think that is part and parcel of aging positively, because you can see it as something that you can deal with, a positive thing, and you don't necessarily have to be sad. Like you say, it depends on the circumstances of how people die. But if it's when it's elderly relatives who are dying, they've had a good life, and it's something that you can talk about, you can have compassion, you can support one another when you're grieving.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we should talk about it more in schools, and we should talk about it as a nation, because it is part of life. We all feel a little bit uncomfortable when we come with someone who has grief and you think, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? And sometimes, as I said earlier, say nothing. But we need to get comfortable talking about it, because it is part of life and it is part of our process. We're born and we grow older and older and older.
And
you
it's
know,
great
as we
growing
know.
old.
And it's great.
But, people can be judgmental, can't they, on how you grieve?
Yeah. Stay in your lane, because it's not your business how I grieve and it's not my business how you grieve. So I think, again, one thing I always say is when people are grieving, just stay in your lane. And what people think about you is nothing to do with you. And I always remember one of the first times I laughed after Lucas had died. I was out with some friends and I laughed. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, I just laughed. Everyone's going to judge me and think I'm not grieving. I was still in deep grief. And actually, it was good that I remembered how to laugh and smile, because I didn't do much of it, I tell you.
How do you help people navigate grief then? How do you get them talking about it?
Well, people come to see me because they want to talk about it and they do want the help and the support. And what's important to me is to witness their grief and allow them the space and the time to talk about it. And I do a really lovely session with them where we talk about where they are. I meet them where they are with their grief. And I just allow people the space and the time to talk. And then I do a really nice deep relaxation just to help them and give them tools where they can do a bit of breath work, and they can also do mindfulness, walking, yoga, whatever suits them. But I definitely think some form of exercise helps. And whether that's just walking through the park, noticing the birds, the grass, the trees, whatever.
Do you think some people get lost because they genuinely haven't got a clue how to grieve? They're too afraid to grieve?
Yeah, some people are. They're afraid of their emotions, aren't they? And again, one of my things is I just want people to be authentic and stand in your power, and be happy, be sad, be how you are, or angry. It's okay. This is all part of being human. We suppress so much. And I think it's about finding your tribe, surrounding yourself with the right people. And the right people, it may not necessarily be family. That family, your friends become your family, and you have to be comfortable enough to be able to just open up and talk to your friends.
It was interesting you said early on that you realise who your friends are and some people step up for you. When you say step up, in what way did you want people, or do you need people to step up?
They're just there for you. How you need them to be there for you, and whatever that looks like, and it could just be a phone call. It could just be a coffee, a walk, someone just to have a moan, a cry, too. And they're not going to judge you for it, but they're going to take that time out of their day just to listen, just to be there.
I know for me, I try and talk to my daughter about when I get old and when I die, and I let her know that I want to be cremated. I don't want to be buried. But I still think, even though I advocate talking about death, I still haven't really talked to her enough about it. There's still that reticence to accept that at the end of the day, she is going to grieve for me. And
yeah,
I don't want that to happen. I don't want to, I don't want to go, and I don't want that to happen. But I also want her to feel happy afterwards as well. So my thoughts are crazy that I want to do a little itinerary for her to have a road trip in a little sports car and scatter my ashes in Ireland and Yorkshire and Scotland and all around the place, and have bottles of bubbly and have a good time. And I want to make it into some kind of joke, but that might not be how she wants to grieve.
It might not be, but if you put all that in a little grief pack for her and write down your wishes, then that's what she's going to do because it's what mum wanted. And she knows your personality, and of course she's going to be sad. You're her rock. You're her mum. You're her everything.
I'm the retirement rebel.
I'm the retirement rebel. Yes. You are a superhero. So she's going to feel sad, but she's also going to be able to celebrate your life because you've had an amazing varied life, haven't you?
Do you think you've impacted on how people who've come to your cafe have been able to deal with death and grieving? And do you think that they will be able to go away and help other people and maybe get the conversation started about, come on, guys, let's talk about death and grieving a bit more?
Yeah, I think I've given them the confidence. No, I wouldn't say I'd say we have given each other the confidence to talk about grief and to talk about our feelings. And what I love about the Meet and Grief Cafe is how I've been able to watch people grow. People have been going there from day dot, and I didn't know if it was going to work or anything. I literally put it out on my socials. And I'm thinking about one particular person, and I've watched that person come from such anger and, she was so angry. And now I'm seeing a completely different side. She's getting out there. She's going on holidays and she's starting to adapt to her new way of life. And I know she'd want her loved one back in a heartbeat, but she now understands that's not going to happen. So she's living life to the full and spending as much time as she can with her children because she realizes how precious life is.
It's incredible that you have been able to turn something so incredibly tragic and painful into something where you're helping other people and you're bringing grief and talking about grief to the forefront. I do admire the fact that you've done that.
Thank you so much. It's what my son would expect. It's what Lucas would expect. He'd be like, have you seen my mother, Nicola? So, I feel him championing me on. And I did sit in the corner, was unable to move pretty much for a year. But then after that, I knew, come on, you've got to get yourself together now and you've got to start to think about a way forward for you.
Do you think it would have been made easier for you if, as a society, we're more open about grief, we were more open about having the conversation? Do you think that would have made it easier for you or not?
Do you know what? I would say it was a really difficult time. And whether I will always talk about it. I'm happy to talk about grief, loss, whatever my feelings are at that time, I'm happy to talk about them. And it's important for me that I do talk about them. But it's also important that I make people feel comfortable enough so that they are able to talk about them.
And you've just done a TED Talk, haven't you, about it, which is amazing. What was that like?
I have. So that was an amazing experience. And it was far more difficult than I thought it was going to be. And it was 6 months of hard, intense work. And it is called The Power of Grieving as a Tribe. Because I do believe that we need to get our tribe around us and grieve together openly and honestly and feel comfortable enough that we can just talk about it. We don't have to hide away. We're not something that we shouldn't be able to talk about. It's something that we should all talk about.
And you talk about finding your tribe. I've definitely found my tribe in Retirement Rebel. And I love the fact that you are part of my tribe as a retirement rebel. But I have to ask all my guests one thing. When was the last time that you felt like a rebel or did something rebellious? That's a naughty laugh. Is it something you can tell me?
I can tell. Well, any chance I can get, I do anything naughty because it just makes me laugh. Anything to make my friends laugh. So the last time I did something rebellious and naughty, I don't know if I can say.
But it's important to be a rebel though, isn't it? Were you a rebel at school?
I love it. I was a chatterbox at school and I was quite, I was always making people laugh at school. Yes. So I was a bit of a rebel. And I was with my tribe, one of my tribes last night, and we're all very naughty and giggly. And it was fantastic. I love being with my tribe.
Well, I can't thank you enough for being part of my tribe and coming on the podcast today. If anybody wants to listen to your TED Talk, where can they hear it? And also keep in touch with you and your social medias. If you want to give us all that information, then we can add it to the show notes.
Okay, that's perfect. So you can see my TED Talk at Nicola Marshall, TEDx Northwich, and www.nicola-marshall.com. And anyone can get in touch with me there on my website.
And what about Instagram? Are you on Instagram or Facebook or anything?
Oh, I am on Instagram. Yes, I'm on nicolamarshall.griefandgrace.
And people can contact you if they want to come along to your cafe and things.
Yes. At the moment, we only do the cafe in person. So if people are local, actually, I have a gentleman who comes from the Midlands and he loves it. So yeah, people can come along. We hold it once a month in Knutsford. And it's a great space. There's always some kind of revelation where someone will find out something and think, oh my gosh, I carried that guilt for 10 years. And now you've just told me that's changed the perspective completely. So yeah, it's a great space to help and support.
That's the beauty. Having conversations like this, people listening to this podcast may go away and then instigate the conversation with their family and friends about grieving and death. And that's what we need more of, isn't it? Just to help people.
I think so. And you know what? I think it's also now about love overcoming everything. And we really do need to help our friends, our neighbours. And it's about I'm crazy for this. If I see someone who looks fabulous in the supermarket, I'll say, oh my gosh, you look amazing. And I'll always smile at people because you never, ever know what's going on the inside. And one thing I know is that I might look okay on the outside, but inside, my goodness me, there was so much pain, at times.
Well, thank you so much, Nicola, for sharing all your experiences and your highs and your lows. And Lucas would be so incredibly, incredibly proud of you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me on, Siobhan. I hope to see you soon.
Well, that was an interesting chat with Nicola Marshall. Talking with her has made me acutely aware that we do need to talk about death and our emotions around the subject of death years before we think we may be facing it, so that relatives are more prepared to carry out our dying wishes and to help them with their grief. Bottling things in will only make things a lot worse when somebody dies. She says we should not be afraid to ask someone how they are, or even to go over and just give them a hug or hold a hand. She says acknowledging the life of a person who's gone by talking about them or remembering them can really help someone who's grieving. Next week, my guest on the podcast is Tracy Aycock. She's the founder of the Wellbeing Wisdom Club, where she mentors and supports thousands of women to age well and to get the most out of their lives. She helps many find a sense of purpose after retirement. Now women look to her for inspiration. I hope you enjoy listening to our chat. Thank you so much for joining me on today's Retirement Rebel Life After 60. I'm truly grateful for your time and your willingness to embark on this journey with me. If today's conversation sparked something within you, or if you've your own rebel story to share, I'd love to hear from you. Please reach out through our social media channels or email, and let's keep the conversation going. Email us on podcast@retirementrebel.co.uk. And remember, if you found value in our time together today, consider sharing this episode with a friend who might also enjoy and benefit from our Retirement Rebel community. Spreading the word helps us grow and continue to challenge the narrative around life after 60. All of our details can be found on retirementrebel.co.uk. Retirement Rebel Life After 60 is written and hosted by me, Siobhan Daniels, and produced by the incredibly talented Matt Cheney. Join me again next week for another episode. Until then, keep embracing your inner rebel and living life to the fullest. Bye for now.